So welcome to the October 8th, 2022. If you were my family member cancer series, we're going to talk about stage 4 colon and rectal cancer. It's actually episode 2 of a 2-part series. So episode 1 of this series is actually online on YouTube. I didn't really publicize it very much. I was waiting until this was done and then we're going to put it on YouTube for people. But this 2-part series, I think, will be the premier stage 4 colon and stage 4 rectal cancer series on the internet. It is intense, right? It's going to be remarkably detailed. And the reason for that is because as I've been talking to patients, including some people who are actually watching this now, it's amazing to me how much patients know, and to really add value and to take it to the next level and kind of give them something they can use as a foundation for their entire life. You really have to kind of take it to a different level. I think a lot of doctors assume that patients don't want to know everything. That's actually not true. I've contended for a long time that's not true. I think patients want to know as much as possible. They just need it given to them in a digestible fashion. And so that's what I really have kind of felt has been confirmed in my recent experience of the last couple of months with patients. And so we're going to do quite a bit today. This is the type of talk where you really can't watch this in one sitting, or you can, maybe you can, but I would recommend maybe watching this in kind of 2 to 3 parts. This is very detailed, and it's intentionally detailed. It will hopefully be kind of provided in a very facile and easy manner, but it is intense. And so I'm trying to give you everything you may need to really take with you on your stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer journey. So, I think when patients have this disease, and people who have this disease can speak much more to this than I can, but there's a lot of questions that are unanswered. And so what we're trying to do is really show you what your particular path might look like from, start to finish. And hopefully there is no end. Hopefully it's just an ongoing path. But the idea is we're trying to remove some of these question marks on your particular cancer road. So, I want to start by just very clearly saying, I said this last time we talked about this 2 weeks ago in episode 1, that there is a lot of hope here, right? I expect people to do very well. Stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer, we're getting better every day. So just remember, you don't have an expiration date. There's a lot of ways to think about this disease that are quite creative. This is one of those cancers, and I treat everything. I think people know that by now, but I treat everything. I treat a lot of stage 4 colon, a lot of stage 4 rectal. And what's unique about stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer is that you can get very creative here. You can really start to think about surgery and radiation and, yttrium-90, radial embolization, and TACE. And so there's a lot of things you can do in stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer you don't really think about as much in like stage 4 breast or stage 4 lung. So you want to be very creative. I remember when I was training at Stanford as a fellow in 2008 to 2012, I trained a guy named George Fisher, and he would do things that were incredibly creative. At the time, you're like, there's really no data to guide this. You're like, it's shocking. And it was like really impressive what he would do. And I'm sure, it's continued throughout his career, but he was one of the pioneers in this regard. You can be very, very aggressive, very creative with stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer. Treatment tends to be, fairly highly effective. It's not unheard of to live very long time. And many clinical trials are ongoing. Actually, many patients are curable in this context. We'll talk about this in a moment. So, I think what's unique about this series is that we don't just go from the trees to the forest. We can take you to the country, the continent, and planet Earth and come back down. That has to do with the fact that we do everything. I just treat stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal, so I can extrapolate from tumor types and bring them in. And so I think that's a little unique. So this particular series for stage 4 colon and stage 4 rectal cancer patients, really it's a 3-part series. There's this initial talk we gave called Optimizing Your Ability to Fight Cancer. That's online. You can start with that if you want. The second talk really was given 2 weeks ago. It's episode 1. It kind of provides a foundation for this talk. This talk's entirely about treatment, right? We're going to go through treatment in detail. I think this is probably the talk for the expert patients who know a lot of things. And I'm going to try and give you a little bit that you might not know. Certainly towards the end of this, we'll talk about all of the different trials that are ongoing. But this particular talk will be all about treatment. So if you watch them in this sequence, that's great. You don't necessarily have to do something. The expert stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer patients can just skip to this particular talk. You can see them at revolutioncancer.com. You can also see them on the YouTube channel, on Revolution Cancer YouTube channel. So I wrote this article called Quarterbacking a Patient's Cancer Care, and I think that people who know me know that it's imperative to understand your opponent. As a cancer doctor, when I'm on your team and I'm trying to help prolong your life and keep you alive or cure you, right? The first thing I'm trying to do is really understand your particular stage 4 colon, your particular stage 4 rectal cancer. And that's what I really want you doing. I want you to understand your opponent. Just realize that no 2 opponents are the same. Like, I just don't care what people say. There are no 2 stage 4 colon cancer, stage 4 rectal cancer patients who are the same. It just does not exist. So when we talk about this, really what you need to appreciate is that when we see patients with stage 4 colorectal cancer, right, I'm just going to group them now, but stage 4 colorectal cancers, we typically think of them as being on a continuum, right? So they can be highly aggressive or they can be fairly indolent, slow growing. So we put them on a continuum. And to do that, we think about their molecular profile. So different molecular profiles tend to have different levels of aggressiveness. We think about their growth rate. So how fast is this growing relative to someone else's tumor? You might have a fast growing cancer, you might have a slow growing cancer. We think about the amount of cancer. Some people walk in the door and they have stage 4 colon cancer with just a single spot in the liver or a single spot in the peritoneum. Or there are other people who come in, they've got, florid disease. It's in the liver, it's in the lungs, it's in the peritoneum. We think about those patients very differently. The approach is very different. Different location metastases. So this actually matters quite a bit. If you're someone with disease that's predominantly in the liver, you would be a candidate for radial embolization procedures that really go after the liver, or surgery that goes after the liver. And if you're a person with disease in the lung, you'd be a candidate potentially for curative surgery, removing part of the lung or a lesion in the lung, or radiation to the lung. And if you have disease in the peritoneum, there's things we think about like high dose peritoneal chemo, so HIPEC, intraperitoneal hypothermic chemo, so hypothermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy. We think about that, and we think about removing these lesions. And so just understand that the location of metastasis matters a lot. Then you need to try to understand your specific cancer. So in this context, you really need to forget about everyone else. I don't care about the person next to you with stage 4 colon cancer. That's not what you need to be thinking about. When I see a patient in my clinic, and I see a lot of patients with this, I'm only thinking about them. Nobody else's cancer matters. How this other person behaved has no impact on how they're going to behave. So just think about your specific cancer. Where is your disease? How much disease do you have? What's the growth rate look like? Is it slow growing? What was the last scan? How does it look now? Those sorts of things. So really focus on your specific cancer. And in so doing, you really got to think about trends, not snapshots. I think we talked about this before in this series, but a lot of people come to me, they say, Avastin, how long do I have left to live? Well, if I'm just looking at one scan in one moment in time, I don't really know, right? I have to see the next scan. And honestly, I'm not thinking about you dying at all. That's not even on my radar. Trying to give you a very long life with a good quality life and trying to cure you if possible. So I'm not thinking this way. But if you pin me down and say, what's my future look like? The only way I'm really going to know that for the most part is if you give me the next scan and the next scan. You give me 6 months of scans and I can kind of see how you're doing, and I can start to prognosticate where we're going. Otherwise, I just don't know, right? Sometimes though, I will say, if there's just a tremendous amount of, it just looks crazy, that can give you an answer also. But in general, that just doesn't happen. And I always want you to ask your scans. Like, I don't care who you are. I want you, and I don't care who your doctor is. I don't care if it's the #1 colon cancer doctor in the world. I don't really believe in things like that, by the way. I don't know how you rank these doctors, but when all is said and done, I don't really care who your doctor is and how busy they are. I want you to pin them down and say, okay, I want to see my scans. It doesn't matter if I'm seeing 30 people a day, I'm still showing people their pictures. It matters a lot. It helps you understand your symptoms. If you have abdominal pain, you've got disease in the abdomen, it kind of makes sense to you, you understand it. It also helps you really kind of say, okay, what does my future look like? What's happening here? And it gives you a feeling of success, right? A feeling of fulfillment. If things go really well and you're doing awesome, that's great. You want to see that. That's really nice to see. You want to see this nice progression that you're improving, and that's a good thing to see. So I wrote this article called Playing Chess Against Cancer. I really want you thinking this way. I want you thinking about what are the moves I'm going to make to optimize my treatment sequence, my treatment path. So I wrote this article. I know several people have read this now. I think 2,500 people have read this now. And I like this approach to thinking about cancer. So the way we kind of think about it, right? And this is really important in colon cancer, stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer. This particular thought process plays a very big role, and I'll come to that. But the idea is you kind of say, okay, what are my big picture options for treating stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer? So I kind of made this comment algorithm here. You can see it in bold. So we think about C, which is conventional options. So what are the drugs that are approved, right? What regimens do we classically use for colon cancer? There's a very big role for chemotherapy. We'll talk about it in a moment. So then O stands for operational, so really surgical options. What are the surgical options here? And this is something you need to revisit at all times. Things may change. The surgical option that may not have been there when you started may now be there 6 months later. So you're always thinking about this. You're always coming back to this particular algorithm. M stands for molecular-based options. We went through that a lot 2 weeks ago. We're going to go through it again today. But what sort of genetic mutations does this cancer have? Can I take advantage of those? Can I use a drug that might target that? Everything else really refers to kind of local regional treatments. So treatments that we use to eradicate cancers in various areas. So if it's the liver, we might use something called radial embolization, which we'll talk about, or TACE, or hepatic arterial infusions, things we'll talk about in a moment. And then trials, T stands for trials, right? So clinical trials. So what you need to do with colon cancer and rectal cancer, almost more than any other cancer, is every time you have a scan, you need to come back to this particular algorithm. You need to go ahead and ask your physician again about, okay, what are my conventional options? What's the operational option? What's the molecular-based option? What's the trial option? What's everything else look like? And you just kind of push them, because sometimes doctors won't think about it. I promise. Like, there are times when I've actually had my patient basically prompt me to think about this when it wasn't on my radar, because I thought, okay, this must be too extensive. It felt like it wasn't going to be an option. And then you explore it a little bit more and you kind of go outside the box, and it is an option. So you may think that this is intuitive, but it's not. So you need to kind of pin your physician down a little bit and come back to this. And just please know that this particular acronym will help you. So the idea here, when it comes to playing chess against cancer, is that when you have a stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer patient, if it's something that's incurable, we'll come back to that, typically using a first-line treatment until patients progress or they don't handle it. Then you go to a second-line treatment until they get worse or they don't handle it, and so on and so forth. So you're thinking about, okay, how do I sequence these treatments to extend a patient's life with tremendous quality? And how do I get better? How do I improve on that? How do I get them decades? I don't want to talk about months. I want to talk about decades. I don't want to talk about years. I want to talk about decades. And so that's really where the thought process is. You're constantly thinking about this. So what you do is you say, okay, what are my conventional options here in yellow? What are my clinical trial options? So this T part here in red, blue, and green, and purple. What are my molecular-based options here in blue? What are my local regional options? So my everything else, my surgery, my radiation, and my other than surgery, the operational options here in green. And then you say, okay, how do I sequence these to optimize someone's longevity? How do I keep them alive for a very long time, or how do I cure them, right? So when all is said and done, basic principles, this algorithm will serve you well, okay? Now, let's go even bigger. Let's go to the forest. So basic principles forest-wise. I want you in stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer to aggressively chase cure if possible. We're going to talk a lot about the role of surgery today. I think it's going to play a central role in a lot of people's treatment. Just understand you don't have an expiration date. You want to play chess against cancer, not checkers. You want to develop your personalized treatment map. It helps you for a lot of reasons I'll come back to later. And you always want to be thinking about comment. So I made this particular slide. I will put this online on revolutioncancer.com where you can download it. I will actually do that with all of this entire series. I haven't done that yet. But if you want this PowerPoint, I will also provide that to you. Just, message me on LinkedIn or whatever. I can give you this entire PowerPoint and the last PowerPoint. You can have every single slide I basically made. Just don't give them out to a whole bunch of people unless they're colon cancer patients. If they are, please give them out. But I will provide all these slides, but I will definitely provide this. So here's how I want you thinking about stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer. I want you thinking about all of these different drugs based on how they act. What's the mechanism? What protein do they target? How do they act? And so I kind of made this particular schematic for you. So there are different drugs that target HER2 overexpressing colon cancer. So if you do the molecular profiling, you find that your cancer makes too much HER2, you would be a candidate for this particular regimen, sulfatinib plus trastuzumab, or this regimen here. If you have a mutation in BRAF at the V600E, like we talked about last time, so this particular mutation, you would be a candidate for this therapy, and so on and so forth. So you can just reference this later. But what I want you thinking about is I want you thinking about how does the drug work? And the idea is pretty simple, right? If your cancer figures out a particular approach, right? So let's say you're getting a VEGF or VEGF-R inhibitor, and your cancer's figured out 2 of these. Well, it's unlikely it's going to respond to this third one because it's basically doing the same thing, right? So that's kind of the way to think about it. You kind of say to yourself, okay, what sort of mechanisms of attack has my cancer seen, and can I punch it from a different direction? Can I shoot it from a different direction? Can I use a different weapon? And so you start to think, okay, what are the actual mechanisms by which these drugs work? Because those constitute different weapons. Now, we went through this extensively in the first talk, and there are really 8 essential questions that people need to answer to know what their path is going to look like. And so this gets really important. I'm going to put this here. I will also provide this online. And then 2 weeks ago, I went through all of this, okay? But first question is there a potential curative approach one can take, right? So we'll talk about this. Second question is, does your cancer have high microsatellite instability? So, this is a molecular abnormality that suggests you would respond to immune therapy if it's high. So again, that first talk talks about this. We will go through this though, don't worry. The third question is the cancer right or left-sided? This has an impact on treatment. The fourth question is, does the cancer have a mutation in RAS? So KRAS, HRAS, NRAS. So again, it's a gene mutation that you're looking for. And if it has a mutation in these proteins, there's certain drugs you can use and cannot use, right? Does the cancer have mutation in this particular gene? So BRAF V600E, that allows you to use a particular regimen. Does the cancer have implication in that protein HER2 we talked about? Are there just liver metastases? So what I mean by this is, when you look at your disease, okay, we talked about this earlier, it's why everyone's disease is unique. Is your disease, the stage 4 disease, restricted to the liver? Like, is most of it in the liver, or is a lot of it elsewhere? Because if most of it's in the liver, there are certain things we can do in that context. So you want to know about that. And then the last thing is you want to know the rest of the molecular profile and to see if you can use it. And we're going to go through all of this now one by one, and we're going to incorporate these questions into the treatment paradigm that I'm about to give you. So when we talk about conventional options, so now we're focusing on the C part of this algorithm, okay? There are different conventional options available to us. Now, you can just look at this. I'm going to actually break this down for you, but I'm just showing you all the conventional treatment options. This is actually in clinical trial. This will be approved. I can almost guarantee that, this particular regimen here. That's why I included it. So let's talk about the role of surgery, though. Let's talk about the O part of this, the operational part. So as opposed to a lot of different stage 4 tumors, surgery plays a central role in the treatment of a lot of patients with stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer, a lot of patients. And so you need to, first of all, understand, is the cancer curable? Is there a curative approach one can take? This may not be obvious, okay? But that is the very first question I'm asking when I see a patient, because there's a world of difference between curing someone, right? And then just trying to keep them on treatment, keep them alive for a long time. So I'm always trying to find, if there's a chance at cure. So the way to determine that is you have to look at the location of the cancer, right? If there's disease that's widespread in the lymph nodes in the belly or in the peritoneum, it's unlikely you can cure that. But if there's disease that's in a localized part of the liver, or say one spot in the lung, you can take a curative approach with that. In addition, you have to look at the tumor burden. So let's say you have disease that's restricted to the liver. If it's just in one part of the liver that you could easily remove, that's potentially curable. But if it's diffusely involving the liver, it's everywhere in the liver, you can't really cure that. You have to look at the patient's functional status. Clearly, a patient has to be able to tolerate these surgeries that are not easy. So you have to look at that, and you have to look at other medical conditions, again, to see if they can tolerate the surgery. But the very first question you need to ask your physician, you need to really pin them down, is this curable, right? With stage 4 colon, stage 4 rectal cancer, this is an important question. It's not the same for stage 4 prostate, not the same for stage 4 breast. We're not thinking that way. But here we're definitely thinking that way. So we can do liver resections for, solitary liver mets or isolated liver mets or restricted liver mets. We can do lung resections for lung metastases that are, say, in one location, right? So you can actually be very aggressive. You can try and take out the lung lesion, right? So that's important. What's not intuitive, this is not intuitive, is there are some people now doing liver transplants for cure, right? So there are patients with lots of disease in the liver we did not think were curable, where now we're finding that maybe they're curable with liver transplant. So Mayo Clinic, Jacksonville in Florida, they do the 3rd most liver transplants in the country. They are now doing liver transplant for stage 4 colon cancer, stage 4 rectal cancer. So please be aware of that. Please also know that the role of surgery may not be obvious to your medical oncologist. I promise you, there are times when I look at a scan and I think, okay, this doesn't look like it's surgically operative, but the surgeon says, yes, it is. So I'm pretty much almost always getting a surgical opinion if I see patients with liver lesions or even disease in the belly. And I'm going to show that in a moment. But I'm always thinking about surgery now, because I'm telling you, as a medical oncologist, I'm not a surgeon. I don't really know what's surgically resectable and what's not. I do know kind of what I want to do here, and I would prefer to debulk. I'd love to do surgery if it's a possibility. So I'm asking my surgeons now all the time to really give me their opinion. They may say, "Hey, Avastin, why are you saying this to me? Not resectable." I'm basically just don't know what I don't know. You need to tell me, right? So it may not be obvious. I need you to inquire aggressively about this because it's not obvious. And then, of course, if you remove the disease where the cancer has spread, to truly cure it, you also have to remove where the disease started, right? So you have to, if the disease started in the colon and went to the liver, you can't just remove the liver spot and leave the colon spot. You have to take out both. So if people are going to do surgery for cure, they're not just going to remove the spot in the liver, they're going to also go after that primary spot where it started. Surgery can still be helpful even if your cancer is not curable. And this is critical, okay? Some of the patients that I have that have done the best are the people with a disease in the belly and it looked awful, and we did debulking surgery, took out as much as possible, and they're alive 10 years later. So I had a patient come in, she was 19, one of my favorite patients of all time. I love all my patients. This patient, particularly unique, this incredible girl who actually did her entire college and master's degree while I was treating her with stage 4 colon cancer. She's this amazing, amazing person. Diagnosed when she was 19, she came in with disease on both ovaries, colon cancer that spread to both ovaries, spread throughout the peritoneum. And we did surgery after surgery after surgery over the course of, almost a decade, trying to, do what we could to keep her alive. She lived a very long time. She did very, very well. She's exceptional. So let's talk about the role of surgery a little bit. So here's a stage 4 colon cancer patient. Okay. They have one spot here in the liver. You can see it. So this patient's a very good candidate for surgery. They just take out this part of the liver, this segment, and take out the primary colon spot. And that's really nice. This patient has a very good chance of being cured. Here's another patient with one spot in the liver. You can see that here, right? This is over time. They actually got treatment and the disease basically stayed the same. So once you've done that, you've done treatment for 6 months or so, even 3, some people do 2, 4, 6 months, but after you've done treatment for a certain period of time, you can see the disease is very stable. That surgery is going to be an option here. It's not exploding on you. Then you start to say, okay, I'm going to take this out and really go for cure. And so that's what this person's doing. We did with this person. They removed the spot and they should hopefully will be cured. So another patient, here's another example. This is actually one spot in the lung. This patient's a very good candidate for cure. They don't have disease in the liver. They've got this one solitary spot in the lung. And so that's actually excellent. So as I talked about last time with episode 1 of this series, stage 4 colon cancer, stage 4 liver cancer typically likes to go to the liver. Stage 4 rectal cancer likes to go to the liver and the lungs. Those are the 2 spots that likes to go. Also goes to the peritoneum, but the bottom, or the belly. But the bottom line is it really likes the liver and the lungs. And so in this patient with just one spot in the right lung, this is actually a very good situation where you can go after this for cure. Here's a patient I think is very interesting. I want everyone to see this because this is something, like I said, it's not intuitive. This patient actually had resection of their disease, then got chemotherapy, and the disease kind of exploded in the liver. You can see all these spots in the liver. They then got a transplant, a liver transplant, and you can see now 1.2 years later, there's no disease in the liver. And so hopefully this person's cured, and that's really a nice outcome. This is a patient of mine. I think this is a shocking case. I presented this recently on LinkedIn. You can see my profile there. But this is my kind of a classic example and why I think it's very important to do this. So when we talk about this particular patient, so this patient came to me, they had this very big mass in the belly. This was actually stage 4 colon cancer. There was a spot in the liver. I'm not showing that here. They had a spot in the colon and then this very big mass, roughly 10 inches in size. Okay. So initially she went to a big name place. That place said, no, we're not going to remove this. Then she came to me in second opinion. I wanted to remove this because I thought to myself, well, this is going to be my main problem here. There was a solitary spot in the liver. There was, this cancer in the colon. There was a lymph node. But when all is said and done, what was really going to affect her and what was going to be her demise was this very big mass in the belly. So I wanted this thing out so I could buy myself room. So I sent her to another surgeon. That surgeon also said no to surgery because of what the first surgeon said. So then I basically was stuck. I had to give her treatment. So we gave her chemo. Okay. We gave her FOLFOX at that time because I was still trying to get to surgery. So I withheld some other drugs. But anyways, gave her chemotherapy. And you can see 2 months later, the liver spot was gone. I'm not showing that here. The colon cancer was better, but this mass got much bigger. So now it's roughly 36 centimeters. So it's increased by 5 to 6 inches. And so at that point I said, okay, I'm done. We got to take this out. So I talked to a friend of mine who's a colorectal surgeon, talked to another surgeon who we knew, and they took this out. So now you can see this actually should be September 2022. You can see now a year later, a year and a half later, there's no disease. She looks really good in this context. And we'll see. I mean, there's no end game here. I'm very happy with where she is. Don't see this mass anymore. It's all gone. This big mass is gone. She doesn't have any liver lesions. By the way, we also did ablate this liver lesion. We actually did kind of microwave ablation on it. So we basically took a very aggressive approach, right? We did chemo, we removed the colon cancer, we removed this big mass, and we also did kind of microwaved the spot in the liver. And now you can see 2 years after her diagnosis, these are wrong. This should actually be very different. September 2022. This is actually a little bit sooner, but roughly 2 years, she's doing exceedingly well. So when we talk about surgery, so just to conclude there, operationally, it's very important to pin down your medical oncologist and really, really get a surgical oncologist's opinion, if you can, to say, hey, is there any role for surgery here? Now, there are a lot of criteria people use, I should back up, to decide if they want to remove disease that's in the belly. Okay, so let's back up again. We talked about cancer in the liver and how people will remove liver lesions if the disease is restricted to the liver and it looks like it's not diffuse, okay? But when we talk about surgery that's not quote unquote curable, okay, we talk about debulking surgery, trying to remove as much of the cancer as possible, like disease in the belly. There are different studies that have looked at this. There are different paradigms that surgical oncologists will use to decide if they want to go remove cancer in the belly. It's imperative that you talk to a surgical oncologist about this, because you will find that some that are very aggressive, they're going to go ahead and do debulking surgeries, remove as much as they can, and some who are very conservative. So you're going to want to get opinions in this regard, because honestly, the medical oncologist may not be well versed in this. And to be honest, I don't even trust my own opinion on this. It may look like it's not something we can remove, but I oftentimes will still get a surgical consult. So we talked about the conventional options, talked about operational options. Let's talk about molecular-based options now. So if you go back to that first talk we gave, I talked extensively about next-generation sequencing, talked about immunotherapy markers, so TMB, PD-L1, MSI, talked about homologous recombination deficiency. Please go back and watch that. I don't want to take too much time looking at that now. Bottom line is this. We're going to look at genetic factors, genetic components of your cancer cell to see if we can use those to attack your cancer in a different way. That's really all I'm saying here. You don't have to know the details, okay? You literally can just ask your physician if they did what's in green. Just say, hey, did you do NGS, TMB, MSI, PD-L1, HRD? That's all you have to do. And you can say, did that provide us with any other options? But the bottom line is you have to do this. This is essential. Pretty much every cancer doctor I know does this, right? I'd be shocked if they don't. But you should ask about it. You should say, hey, did it show you any other options I can use? And we're going to talk about this extensively. So there are particular genes that we're interested in when it comes to knowing your opponent in the molecular profile. So we look at PD-L1, that's actually just a protein expression profile, not a gene. We look at MSI and TMB, it's really just measures of genetic instability in the cancer cell. And then we look at these genes in red. So it's really the red genes we're looking at among others. But these are the ones you want to ask about. Again, we'll come back to this. So then we talk about the E part, everything else. And so this is something also to be aware of. I think everyone needs to kind of think about this. So colon cancer, unique in the sense among other stage 4 cancers, stage 4 rectal cancer also unique, that you can do a lot of different aggressive approaches to attack particular cancers in certain areas in the body. So we do something called radial embolization. So that's where you inject these beads coated with radiation into the arteries that feed the cancer in the liver. And the idea is that these beads will emit radiation and kill the cancer in the liver. So there are different ways of doing this, something called yttrium-90 spheres, but you're going to want to ask about this if you have liver-only disease or liver-predominant disease. In addition, we can do ablation where we can actually put a needle into the tumor itself and we can fry it either with microwaves or radio frequencies. That's really useful. Stereotactic body radiation therapy is where we can basically radiate, just do kind of high doses of radiation to targeted areas in the body to try and attack it. So here you can see a lung lesion where we're basically radiating that. So SPRT is something to ask about. External beam radiation, that's kind of aggressive radiation also, but that's where it gets more of an area. It's not as targeted as SPRT. And then there's many more for people with disease in the belly. Some people use HIPEC. So this hyperthermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy, that's, you know, a little bit challenging, a little controversial, something to talk about. And then there's clinical trials. So everyone kind of knows about clinical trials at this point, but clinical trials are essentially experiments designed to save lives. We're going to talk a lot about the clinical trials ongoing in colorectal cancer now. I actually looked at over about 100 of these recently. They're ongoing as we're speaking. I'll talk about those later. But just go to clinicaltrials.gov, watch that first talk I gave, you know, and you'll get a better understanding of this. So putting it together, we're now going to really start talking about your particular treatment plan. So let's kind of think about that. So I'm just going to give you this very quick example. Here's a patient of mine who had these genetic abnormalities in their cancer, okay? And so what I typically do when I see a patient is I say, okay, what are my options? So I kind of group them, and then I decide, okay, what am I use first? What's my second? What's my third? So this is actually a patient who 4 years later is still on her first option, right? I still have all these options behind it. And so this is just one way to think about your cancer. So we're going to talk about this now paradigm. We're going to go through the details. So here we go. So when we talk about stage 4 colorectal cancer, the first thing we're thinking about is, okay, what's our first approach going to be? What's shot 1, right? And we kind of run through our algorithm now. So conventional options classically will include chemotherapy or immunotherapy. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Surgery is very important to inquire about. With shot 1, you got to ask right away, am I a surgical candidate? And again, you got to come back to it every single time you have a scan. Hey, have things changed? Am I a surgical candidate? It's unlikely that you will become a surgical candidate if you were not initially, but you never know. Molecular studies are essential, local, regional, everything else. You've got to ask about it, and you got to ask about clinical trials. So this just needs to be a reflex for you. Every time you see your doctor, every time you have a scan, you need to say, okay, I'm going to run through this algorithm. That's a reflex. Just push them. Just push them. Not in a bad way, right? But patients are incredibly educated now. You're here watching this because you're incredibly educated in terms of your disease. I expect my patients to ask these questions. I want them to. And so please don't think you're going to offend anyone. The doctor needs to make time to be able to answer these questions. It's part of our job. So again, it's these 8 essential questions that help us decide what your treatment path is going to look like. So first question is it curable? So we talked about why this is important. So if it's curative, okay, if there's a curative approach to take, in general, what you will have done is you will likely get chemotherapy, okay? And there's different chemotherapy options. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but there's different chemotherapy backbones, okay? So chemotherapy we use. And then they might add an EGFR inhibitor. I will talk about that later too, but you'll get treatment up front, okay? We're going to talk about this in a moment. Then you'll typically have surgery, and then they'll do treatment behind it. Or you could get surgery up front, then treatment behind it, or you could get treatment and surgery and be done. So just understand there's different ways to do that. Classically, what we do in my clinic is we'll do treatment up front. We'll do, say, 2 months of treatment, 2 to 4 months. We'll rescan, make sure we know where we are, and then we'll do surgery and come back to more treatment, okay? But eventually what you want, what's ideal is if you're curative, eventually this is a finite process. It doesn't go on infinitum, right? At some point, we will stop treatment entirely and say, okay, we hope you're cured. We'll do scans after to see if you're cured or not. Now, the only difference between stage 4 colon and stage 4 rectal cancer really is that not only will you have surgery, but we will also do chemotherapy and radiation to the rectal area. So we'll do chemotherapy with radiation together to the rectal area to optimize your chance at cure before we do surgery to the rectum. So that's the one addition here between stage 4 colon and stage 4 rectal. So this is another kind of approach. You can do the surgery up front, the chemo up front, then the surgery, or you can do the surgery up front, then the chemo. Most people will not do that. Most people will do chemotherapy before surgery. Then rectal cancer, again, if you do all the chemo up front, then you do the chemotherapy and the radiation to the rectum, and then you take out the tumor. Those are just different approaches. So curative approach in terms of trying to define if you're a curative candidate, you have to really define the tumor biology. So what I typically do is I'll say, okay, what does the scan look like with the surgeons, not just me, right? So if you have a solitary liver spot, you look like someone who's curable. We typically will give you 2 months of chemotherapy before, or 4 months, 2 to 4 months. And the idea behind that, okay, is number one, we want to make sure that your cancer doesn't explode on us in 2 months, right? Because if the cancer explodes on us in 2 months, it suggests it was already there. So let me back up. I think this is really important to know. When you see a 1 centimeter cancer on a scan, that's less than half an inch, right? 2.54 centimeters equal to an inch. So if you see a 1 centimeter cancer on a scan, that's 100 million cancer cells, at least. Many people say 1 billion, okay? So you can have 1 million cancer cells out there. That's 0.1 millimeters. We never see that on a scan, okay? So the idea behind doing chemotherapy up front, in part, is to shrink the tumor to make it easier to cut out, but in part is to say, okay, is anything else out there? Am I going to see a whole bunch of stuff in 2 months, which means that you shouldn't have done surgery in the first place? Or is everything pretty stable or getting better where we can do surgery? I'm just trying to find out, is there anything else out there that would make it so we shouldn't do surgery? And so that's what we're typically doing. In addition, like I said, it shrinks the tumor to improve surgical outcomes. And the nice thing is it gets all of the cancer at one time. So if we're doing chemotherapy up front, that gets everywhere. Surgery would only take care of the spot that you're cutting out, right? So you get everywhere while you're trying to see what the disease is going to do. And then once you know, you have a good feel for the tumor biology, how your cancer behaves, then you can say, okay, I'm going to go for broke. And now I'm going to go all or nothing. Now I'm going to try and take out the disease. I shouldn't say all or nothing, but go for broke, okay? So surgery may include removal of the liver and or a lung spot. You can actually, sometimes if a patient has 1 spot in the lung, 1 spot in the liver, you can cut them both out, right? And then take out the primary and still cure that patient. Or you can take out the liver spot, you can radiate the lung spot and cut out the primary tumor, or you could basically microwave ablate this spot in the liver. You could radiate the spot in the lung, and then you can cut out the primary tumor. So there's lots of things you can do here. That's why I said that COMET algorithm is so important in stage 4 colon, stage 4 lung cancer, because you can get very creative as a cancer doctor. There's no set rule here. You can be very, very creative, right? And so, you will ultimately have to remove the primary colon and rectal tumor if you're going for a curative approach like we talked about. For rectal cancer, remember that chemotherapy and radiation part of this to try and increase your chance at cure. And then remember, liver transplant is a rare but viable option for some people. So just remember that. So is it curable? So we kind of talked about this. So let's say if it's not curable, so now the answer is no, right? So, roughly 60% of people, the answer will be no. So now we're going to talk about those individuals. So we just talked about people where the answer is yes. Now we talk about the people where the answer is no. So when we talk about not curative sorts of situations, and I hate this kind of word. I don't think about this very much. I mean, I definitely think about, can I cure it? And then after that, I'm thinking about just, I don't really think about death at all. So the word curative for me, a little challenging, very important in terms of trying to define the treatment up front. Beyond that, I'm not thinking about death. So I just don't necessarily like the way that's said. Anyways, the bottom line is, again, you need to go through your comment algorithm, but let's really talk about kind of how we decide what we're going to do. So if you are in theory incurable, even if you're curable, one of the first questions for us is, does the cancer have high microsatellite instability or is it mismatch repair deficient? So I talked a lot about this 2 weeks ago. It's on YouTube. You can go look at that. But here's the deal. When we do that molecular profiling I talked about, there's going to be something called MSI that you can go and ask your doctor about. And you're going to say, okay, was there a lot of microsatellite instability, MSI, which basically means a lot of DNA instability. And the reason you're going to ask about that is because if there was, then you are a tremendous candidate for immune therapy. So immune therapy, like we talked about before, is treatment that's designed to stimulate the immune system to attack your cancer, okay? So if your MSI high, the reflex from your oncologist, which most likely would be that you're going to get immune therapy. So I use this a lot. I just gave a talk an hour and a half ago on this, how immune therapy is incredibly effective in this context. So you're going to want to know if your cancer's MSI high or not. Now, only about 5% of stage 4 colon cancer is, but with that, stage 4 rectal cancer. But with that said, if you are, it makes a huge difference. So you're going to want to ask about that. Another thing that you can ask about is your cancer mismatch repair deficient? So we have proteins in our body that help repair damage in DNA. They're called mismatch repair proteins. So if those are intact, that's one situation. But if they're not, if they're deficient, if something's wrong with them, then you are also a very good candidate for immune therapy. So you're just going to want to ask these questions, okay? If the answer is yes, that you're MSI high and or mismatch repair deficient, they tend to go hand in hand, by the way, then you are a candidate for immune therapy. And so the immune therapies we typically use, right? You can either get a drug called Keytruda or a drug called Opdivo. There's 2 names for each drug, so I included them here for you just to reference easily. Don't worry about the details. Again, don't worry about any of the details I'm giving you. You can come back to this. You can reference this. I'm just trying to give you the big picture while I give you the trees, and you can take what you need, okay? Just come back to it. So Opdivo, Jemperli is a drug that was approved for this. And then you can do a combination of immune therapy. So these drugs, all of these drugs, right, designed to stimulate the immune system to attack your cancer. They are all very effective treatments if you're high in MSI or deficient in mismatch repair. So you need to ask about this. If you are, then the first shot you're going to get, the first bullet in the gun, is going to be immune therapy. They're going to use this particular treatment. The nice thing about this treatment is a very high juice to squeeze ratio. It's very safe and highly effective. And it, almost always works, in my opinion. Every patient I've had has worked, although response rate's about 50%, but it works extremely well and people live a very long time in this context, or the duration of response is very nice. So here's a great example of a patient with this very big cancer that had spread from their colon cancer. They got immune therapy because they were MSI high, and you can see that disease immediately got better. So that's a really nice response, and that's something I would expect. So side effects of immune therapy, just big picture immune therapy. And so here's kind of some of the options we talked about. But and it's actually, that's a little bit incorrect here. Don't worry about this. Just look at what I did earlier. This is taken from a different slide. But basically MSI or TMB high immune therapy is an option. So side effects are when you turn on someone's immune system, right? These treatments are designed to stimulate your immune system. When you stimulate someone's immune system, the problem is that your immune system can attack not just your cancer, but can attack you. It can attack your colon, attack your lungs. It can attack your pituitary, it can attack various organs, your thyroid. So we worry about those side effects when your immune system is attacking you. Now, the nice thing is they're not that frequent. People do very well. So this is very safe. But just to talk about it, if your immune system attacks your colon, you might have diarrhea, abdominal pain, attacks your lungs, might cause shortness of breath, attacks your kidneys, kidney failure, and so on and so forth. You're just going to want to make sure your physician is aware of all of your symptoms. When you're getting immune therapy, you have to take diarrhea more seriously than say if you're getting chemo. So you just got to let us know That's the key here, but in general, immune therapy is very safe. Okay, so let's say that when you go to question 2, your cancer is not MSI high or mismatch repair deficient. So 95% of people will not be. So the answer is no. So in patients like you where immune therapy is not a good option, you're typically going to get chemotherapy, okay, plus minus a VEGF inhibitor, plus minus an EGF or an EGFR inhibitor. So let me explain that. Okay, let me explain that. So essentially, all of you are going to have a chemotherapy backbone to your treatment. Okay. Now there are different treatment options here. You can use something called FOLFOX, which is 5-FU leucovorin oxaliplatin, 3 drugs. Don't worry about the details here. Okay. Just big picture. You can use something called Zelox, so Xeloda plus oxaliplatin. You can use FOLFIRI, so 5-FU leucovorin irinotecan, so instead of oxaliplatin, using irinotecan, or you can use FOLFOXIRI, which is all 4 drugs. A lot of people are moving towards this. I think that's fine. Whatever people use here is perfectly reasonable. Please know there's really no wrong answer here, okay? Now, what people will do is they will not typically just use a chemotherapy backbone. In general, they're going to add either an inhibitor of a protein called VEGF or an inhibitor of a protein called EGFR. Now, let's talk about this for a minute. In order for you to get one of these drugs that inhibits EGFR, your cancer has to be left-sided. I'll talk about that in a moment. Can't be right-sided. And it cannot have a mutation in one of these RAS proteins. So KRAS, HRAS, or NRAS, or BRAF, okay? So that's really important to know. Now, a lot of people like me typically will use FOLFOX plus Avastin. That's what we'll start with. Or some people will use FOLFOX plus panitumumab. It doesn't matter, okay? The bottom line is you're gonna see some derivation of this. And the idea is you use a chemotherapy backbone, then you use either a VEGF inhibitor or EGFR inhibitor if a patient can tolerate it. If the cancer is right-sided or it has a mutation in RAS or BRAF, you will not use an EGFR inhibitor up front. You will not use this, okay? There's a lot of debate about which chemotherapy backbone to use. They're all correct choices in my opinion. Left-sided, some argue that you should use this instead of this. So what I mean by that is cancers that are on the left side, some people will argue this drug is more effective than this drug. And so they might use that. That's also something to take with a grain of salt. It does not matter. The bottom line is you're going to get some variation on a theme. You'll have the chemotherapy backbone and people will use one of these 2 drugs based on your type of cancer. So in general, when we talk about these treatments, they're often used in combination. You can see here's the chemotherapy backbone now just kind of blown up for you, just easy to appreciate. There's no real rule about how to sequence them. You can start with this and then go to this. You can start with this. There's really no set rule, okay? The idea though, is you want to show the cancer different methods of attack, right? You want to hit that cancer in multiple ways. So if it figures out one pathway, it may not know how to deal with this other sort of method of attack. So that's what you want to do. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, okay, is we will typically start with the pretty big gun chemotherapy backbone. And then once we've done a certain amount of treatment, we will back off, okay? We'll say, okay, we don't want to keep hitting you this hard. We want to find a treatment that's not as hard to handle, that still contains your disease. So typically we'll start with a backbone and then we'll go to a maintenance, right? So we'll say, okay, if you're getting FOLFOX, I'm going to cut out the oxaliplatin and I'm going to go to 5-FU plus leucovorin, or I might go to something called Xeloda. These are basically the same, okay? So 5-FU and Xeloda are the same drug. Xeloda is just the oral form of 5-FU. So please just know that these are the same, right? But the idea is that we're typically going to use a pretty big gun chemo, then back off and then use a maintenance, okay? So let's talk about side effects. Now this is a lot here, okay? Don't worry about this. You can come back to it. But if you're gonna get FOLFOX, okay, we typically give this treatment every 14 days. All 3 drugs are given on the first day, then you go home with a pump that infuses the 5-fluoro Uracil drug for the first 2 days. So you basically get treatment 2 days on and then 12 days off and then we repeat, okay? Zelox is very similar to FOLFOX. It's essentially the same drug. Xeloda is the same as 5-FU, but this is more of an oral treatment. So oxaliplatin is a chemo you get once every 3 weeks. And then Xeloda you would get basically in a pill form twice a day, 2 weeks in a row, 1 week off. These details don't matter. Your doctor can go over them. But what I do want to talk about is some of the side effects, okay? So side effects of 5-fluoro Uracil, okay? And Xeloda, same drug. Diarrhea, mouth sores, rash on the hands and feet, can very rarely affect the heart, can cause some mild abdominal pain. But those are the big ones. In general, it's pretty safe. but it can be a nuisance, right? You can get this profound rash on the hands and feet. So I always tell my patients to moisturize twice a day. You get these profound mouth sores that's very difficult to prevent, and they can be a nuisance. So we use things like magic mouthwash to control the pain. We use baking soda rinses to try and help reduce the number of them that you'll get. It very rarely affects the heart. That's usually not a problem. And then you can kind of see the big time diarrhea, abdominal pain sort of things. So typically we use Imodium AD. We use something called Lamodal, tincture opium if we need it, but hopefully that's not necessary. A lot of people just get away with Imodium AD. They do just fine. But the bottom line is those are principal side effects of 5-glucocorn or Xeloda, okay? So next thing to talk about is oxaliplatin. So oxaliplatin is a drug pretty much everyone will experience. And the thing about oxaliplatin, it's a good drug, but one thing I hate about this drug is the neuropathy. So neuropathy, numbness, tingling, hands and feet can become painful. It tends to get worse as you get more doses, okay? It can actually last much longer than you get the treatment. So you stop the treatment, it can last beyond that. In addition, one thing that's very frustrating for patients and for us and for me is that even when the patient's doing fine while they're getting the treatment, once you stop the treatment, sometimes the neuropathy can happen later, it's delayed, which is very frustrating, okay? Neuropathy is a challenge. There's no great way to prevent this. Lots of people looking into this. Anyone who can figure this out will be a multi-billionaire, and they should be. I hope they make a ton of money. Hope someone figures this out because it's a nuisance. But drugs we use to treat neuropathy, things like Neurontin, otherwise known as gabapentin, pregabalin, otherwise known as Lyrica, the drug called amitriptyline, some people use Cymbalta, it doesn't matter, okay? Just want you to have heard them in case you run into this later. But that's the principal side effect of oxaliplatin we worry about. The other side effect we worry about is cold sensitivity. So if you get oxaliplatin, you can't really eat or drink anything cold for a few days after, so room temperature things. It just doesn't feel very good, feels like shards of glass going down your throat, drink something cold. In addition, infection, the kidneys, we worry a little bit about. But in general, people do very well with this. They get fatigued at times, but I do think in general, people do pretty well. Fulfiri is the same treatment as Folfox, except instead of oxaliplatin, you're getting irinotecan, okay? So now you don't get as much as that numbness, tingling, neuropathy stuff. Now it's more you worry about diarrhea and sorts of abdominal pain, same sort of schedule. Then Fulfiri is all 4 drugs. Doesn't matter, okay? You can come back to the slide. I kind of made it very easy. I color-coded things for you. I also put side effects here. Just reference this slide if you want. Ask me for the PowerPoint, I'll send it to you, okay? So that's shot 1, all right? So now, as we continue, okay, now the question becomes when you're trying to define what to do with shot 1. Okay, so shot 1 has this chemotherapy backbone. All right, we know that. Now you're trying to decide, do you want to add this drug, so panitumumab or cetuximab, an EGFR inhibitor, or do you want to add this drug, a VEGF inhibitor? So the way we decide that, what to add to your chemotherapy backbone, okay, is we go through some of these other questions now. So we ask the question, is your cancer right-sided or left-sided? If your cancer is left-sided, so we're talking about the sigmoid colon, so left side of the body. So we're talking descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, okay? And part of the transverse colon, which I'll show you. If it's left-sided, then you are a candidate for these drugs. If it's right-sided, so ascending colon, cecum, you are not. So if it's right-sided, these drugs over here are not an option. So it's very important for you to ask your physician, where did my cancer start, right? What part of the colon? Was it in the rectum, right? Because that will help you decide if you're a candidate for one of these drugs or not, if that can eventually be one of the tools in your toolbox, one of the bullets in your gun. That's really important. The other question to answer to really know if you can get this drug is, do you have a mutation in this RAS gene, either KRAS, HRAS, or NRAS? If you do, you are also not a candidate for these drugs, the EGFR inhibitors. So that's good to know too, okay? So if you have a patient who has a mutation in one of these genes, they cannot get one of these drugs either. If you are, so the 5th question to ask, like the next question is, do you have a mutation in BRAF V600E? This is another gene. Just ask your physician, don't worry, this comes from the molecular profile I talked about. If you do, then you actually can get this drug, but we don't typically do it right away. We'll do it with a drug called encorafenib, and we'll come back to that later, okay? But here's the deal. If your cancer is on the right side, or has a mutation in RAS, you will not get one of these 2 drugs, okay? We will use this one with the chemotherapy backbone, okay? If your cancer has this mutation, you will not get this drug. We'll typically use this with the backbone, and then we'll use one of these drugs later on in one of these other bullets in the gun. So I hope that's clear. We can just come back to this, review this, but the bottom line is you answer these questions to come up with what drug you're going to add to your chemotherapy backbone. So everyone gets this backbone. We decide on which one of these to use based on these questions here. So let's talk about some of the side effects of these other drugs. So let's talk about Avastin, otherwise known as bevacizumab. This is a very safe drug, honestly, but it does have some side effects. The way this drug works is it blocks new blood vessel formation. So when cancers grow, they need more oxygen. To get oxygen, they need to have blood that brings oxygen to them, right? So they need new blood vessels to increase the amount of blood that comes, and in turn, the amount of oxygen that comes to them. And so Avastin, by blocking that blood vessel formation, can cause blood vessel related side effects. So 1% stroke, 1% blood clots, 1% bleeding. It's very rare. It's extremely atypical for me to have to deal with that or address that. When it happens, it's obviously a nightmare, but it's pretty rare. You can get high blood pressure, high blood sugars. It can actually perforate the bowel. You get a hole in the bowel. That's also very rare. So please note this is in general very safe. It can affect the kidneys too. So you have to monitor the kidney function. Please be aware of that. If you're getting this drug Avastin, they're going to check your urine every time you get it because they want to make sure you're not spilling protein in the urine, which would indicate kidney function, which would indicate we have to make a change. So don't be alarmed if they're asking for your urine when you get this drug. In fact, you should be alarmed if they're not. They should be asking for your urine. These EGFR inhibitors, these two drugs here, panitumumab and cetuximab, the big side effect there, okay, and it's a giant side effect, is this rash. It is a profound rash. This is not like a subtle rash, guys. This is a profound rash that can be a nightmare to contain. So I typically put my patients on antibiotics. I use doxycycline. Sometimes we involve a dermatologist to help us with this, use steroid creams for this. This is a very big issue. You can have an allergic reaction to the drug. That's a real side effect. It's a real issue. So we watch for that when we're giving you the drug. Fatigue, diarrhea, etc. In general, pretty well handled, except for that rash, which can be a significant issue. You cannot get this drug, just to reiterate, if you have one of these mutations in RAS, or it's a BRAF V600E mutation, not up front, or right-sided cancer. Okay, good. So that was a lot. I know that was a lot. It was intentionally a lot. I did that on purpose, okay? Just go back. Just take it easy. It's really simple. Chemotherapy backbone, doesn't really matter what they want to use. Then they'll use one of these two options based on the things we talked about. That's it, okay? So now we talk about response assessment. So what we typically will do is we give you 2 months of treatment, then we'll say, okay, how are we doing, right? How are things going? So we'll do a CT scan to really assess this. So we'll look at the liver and say, okay, look, it looks like things are better. So you can see in this patient, right? They basically got 6 cycles of treatment. So 3 months later, they got treatment, the FOLFOX plus Avastin. So they got this plus this. You can see their treatment, their disease is much better than the liver. Then they got another 3 cycles. And again, the disease is much better than the liver. And now with this patient, you can start talking about other options, right? You can start saying, okay, can I do the Y90 radial embolization? Can I go after this now in a different way? And so that's the beauty of this. You're always coming back to those options saying, hey, can I do something different now? So that's why it's important, right? So the way we do this response assessments, we look at scans like you can see every 2 to 3 months. We do these biomarkers. So I think people know, right? Colon cancer can make something called carcinoembryonic antigen, CEA. It's a protein that it can make in the blood. So the higher the level of that CEA, oftentimes the worse the cancer is. So we can monitor that CEA to see if it comes down, suggesting the treatment's getting better, right? And so we typically will look at the CEA, we'll do the scans, and now be aware that some people are going to start looking at cell-free tumor DNA. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes cancer cells can release some of their DNA when they die. Some of the DNA in the cancer cells you'll find in the blood. So you can measure the quantity of that DNA, the cancer DNA in the blood. And if that goes down, it also suggests you're doing better. So that's still a little experimental. It's still not being done routinely, but just be aware that that might be something you see in the future, okay? Now, once you've done all these scans, you're typically making changes based on the scans. If it's stable or improved, right, we typically continue treatment and we start thinking about other options. If it's progressing, the disease is worse, obviously you're going to change treatment. So here's a very nice kind of example. So this is a patient of mine, stage 4 colon cancer. This is actually a PET scan. Sometimes we do PET scans in unique situations. Don't worry too much about that. This patient had disease in the liver, extensive disease in the liver when we started. Okay, here you can see these big spots in the liver. Here's the spot in the actual colon. So they have disease in the colon, disease in the liver, disease in the liver. This is the bladder, that's normal, don't worry about that. So I gave him treatment, and 2 months later, you can see the disease in the liver is way better. This is much better, all the disease here is gone. These 2 big spots are almost gone, right? This spot here in the colon, almost gone. His cancer marker, the CEA, correlates with what we're seeing on the imaging. See, the CEA was initially roughly 52, and now it's normal less than 5, right? So we're very happy with how he's doing. And now we're starting to kind of think outside the box, thinking about surgery, things of that nature. But the bottom line is this cancer cell can make this protein called CEA. You can see that here. You find that in the blood and you can measure it. So now we've talked about kind of the treatment, the initial big gun treatment. We talked about response assessment. Now we're going to talk about the maintenance treatment. So after we've done treatment for a while, I typically do roughly 8 cycles. So I typically do 4 months. I start to say to myself, okay, if I can't cure this, I want to back off treatment and see if I can get to a maintenance treatment where I can get to a better place. Some people do that after 12 weeks. So after 12 weeks, 6 months, some people do it then. I do it after 4 months, while they're trying to find a way to get to a little bit easier regimen. So what I'll typically do is I'll continue 2 of the drugs in my full fox or my backbone, right? Or I'll continue Zolo if that was part of my backbone, and I will cut out either the oxaliplatin or the irinotecan or both if we were doing that. So I'm trying to take away the drug that's the most toxic, the most intolerable, right? So I'm cutting that drug out and I'm using maintenance treatment to keep this cancer at bay, right? To make sure it doesn't come back. So that's typically what you're going to see. You're going to get the big gun chemo, kind of drive down the tumor, and then you're going to use the maintenance treatment to keep it at bay. And the maintenance treatment will likely involve part of that backbone, not oxaliplatin or irinotecan. And then whatever they were using in addition to that is typically what we'll do, what I do. The choice will obviously depend on what they started with. So, we talked about kind of 5-glucovorone, we talked about the side effects, talked about Zolota. You can look at this later. Same side effect profile. You guys already know this based on what we talked about. So the way it works, right, once you're on maintenance is, again, it's just you're constantly assessing response, right? You're saying, okay, we treat you, then we do a response assessment 2 to 3 months later. Then treatment 2 to 3 months later, we do the CT, we do the tumor markers. That's all we're doing. It's just rinse and repeat, right? If things are the same, we stay the course. If things are worse, we change. If you're having a hard time tolerating treatment, I will say to myself, okay, can I back off treatment entirely? Are we in a good situation? Did things look really good? Can I give you a treatment break? So you might see things like that, but this is the overlying principle. So one of the questions we need to answer at this point, okay, now that we've kind of done treatment up front, if you're not curable, if I can't do surgery, one of my big questions is, well, is the disease really in the liver? Has it gone somewhere else, or is it mostly in the liver? If it's in the liver, you answer yes to this. There are some options here. So options to treat liver disease, okay, like I said, is we can use radial embolization. We talked about this earlier, but we inject these beads into the blood vessel supply of the tumor that's in the liver, and we can essentially try and eradicate the cancer that way. So please ask your doctor about radial embolization if your disease is largely restricted to the liver. In fact, just ask, okay? We can also microwave these or do radio frequency ablation, where we just kind of burn them like in various ways. We can do radiation if the disease is in the lung. So forget the liver for a moment. If there's a solitary spot in the lung or a couple, we might just radiate those, okay? We can also do external beam radiation to those, not so much the liver, but there to the lung. We can do something called hepatic arterial infusion for the liver. So different options, okay? The bottom line is you want to know, is the disease restricted to the liver, because certain options there, and you want to know, is the disease in various locations, is it just in the liver, lung, in a couple spots in the lung? Can I go after those separately? So here's a patient, okay, who basically got this hepatic arterial infusion, where we basically injected chemo directly into the liver spot. You can see here that the spot gets a lot smaller and essentially gone just from that hepatic arterial infusion. So they basically take this catheter, they inject it into the liver lesion here, and so that's what they're doing. So here's a patient who is getting stereotactic botulinum therapy to a lung spot. So you can actually treat lung spots this way. Typically, we don't do this sort of radiation. We typically do this SBRT, this localized radiation. So, okay, we've done shot 1 entirely. First line's entirely done. You've done phenomenally. I take a breath. It's a lot, okay? So now we think about shot 2. What if the cancer figures out the first treatment? Okay, well, again, you're going to ask about comment. You're just going to run through this. You're going to say, okay, let's revisit all of this. What are my conventional options? Is surgery an option? What are the molecular-based options here? Do we need to resequence? Is there a role to test this again and look and see if something changed? What does everything else look like? Can I do radiation to the lung? Can I do radial embolization to the liver? And then what are my clinical trials? Again, you're always going to ask about clinical trials, right? You always want to do better. You always want to say, hey, is there a new option? Is there something that came out? Is there a better option for me? Always pushing your doctor, asking about trials. Okay, so when those are not options, like there's no trial, okay, if we're just talking about conventional treatment, typically what will happen with this shot 2, this second line treatment, is again, you'll get a chemotherapy backbone, but it will be different than the chemotherapy backbone you got with the first treatment, right? If the cancer's figured out the first treatment, you're not gonna do the same thing. So you would do something different. What I mean by that is, let's say your cancer was treated with FOLFOX to start. So you got 5-FU-glucovorone oxaliplatin. What your doctor will do next is they will likely say, okay, I'm going to switch to FOLFIRI. I'm going to use irinotecan instead of oxaliplatin, okay? And vice versa. If you started with this, they're going to go to the other regimen, oxaliplatin. So that's all it is. It's really that simple. They're just going to switch the chemotherapy backbone to the one you didn't get to start. In addition, if you progressed on Avastin, people will either use Avastin or they'll use a drug called ramucirumab or aflibercept. They all act the same way. They'll just switch it out, or they might continue it. Amazingly, there's data to suggest that continuing makes sense. Or if you got one of these drugs to start, they might switch to this if you're a candidate for those, and vice versa. So listen, the bottom line is simple, okay? You're going to get some variation on this theme. It's going to be different than the variation on the theme you got initially, okay? And that's all you really need to know. That's it, okay? Now, there are some special cases, and this is really important. If your cancer makes HER2 at a high level, and again, just ask your doctor. Again, you just need to ask about it. It's simple. Don't worry about the details, just ask. If your cancer makes too much HER2, then they are likely going to use a regimen where you get a drug called lapatinib and a drug called trastuzumab, okay? Again, remember tucatinib, like I talked about earlier, will be approved here, you might get that. But the bottom line is they'll use a regimen that targets that HER2 protein. If your cancer has this mutation, BRAF V600E, then they're likely going to use this treatment, encorafenib cetuximab. So that, to make it more clear, now you're going to answer these two questions when it comes to shot 2. You're going to say, okay, does my cancer have a BRAF V600E mutation? If the answer is yes, then they will likely use this treatment, okay? If the answer is yes to whether or not it has a HER2 application, they will use this treatment. If the answer is no to both, then like I said, they're just going to switch the chemotherapy backbone and they'll use some variation on this thing. And that's it, okay? So let's say the answer is yes, okay? So if the answer is yes, then if you have this mutation, they're going to use this treatment. If you don't, if you have this particular amplification, they're going to use this. So let's talk about side effects there. So encorafenib, just to talk about this drug, it's given orally. Side effects, diarrhea, rash, fatigue. So that's fine. Pretty safe drug, okay? So cetuximab, we already talked about. And then HER2, these drugs here can affect the heart. That's the big side effect, diarrhea, rash, fatigue, but in general, very well tolerated. Okay, so here's a good example of a patient with a BRAF V600E mutation. See here, they had this disease in the liver. They got this treatment, encorafenib plus cetuximab, disease is gone in the liver. So that's a beautiful result. And look, they're doing really well. You know, a year and 3 months later, there's no disease that you can see. Here's a patient who had a HER2 abnormality, so an abnormality in HER2. They got treatment with trastuzumab plus lapatinib. You can see their CEA was 1100, very high cancer marker, went all the way down. You can see here, what, almost 2 years later, a year and 3/4 later, they're doing great, no cancer that you can see on the scan. This spot is gone. So this little spot that was here is now gone. So again, as you're on shot 2, just like your whole process, right? Treatment, then response, treatment, then response. So 2 to 3 months to do CT and markers. I actually do the markers every time I see a patient. So every 2 weeks they're coming in, 2 to 3 weeks for treatment. I'm always doing the markers. But the bottom line is this is how people will follow you. Okay, so now you've had the first 2 treatments, right? Let's say your cancer's figured out both of these. The question becomes what's next, right? So the next option for you may involve a drug called Lonsurf. Some people use a drug called regorafenib, and I'll talk in a moment, but Lonsurf is a typical treatment used here. Again, I want you to explore all these other options, okay? I want you to say, what are my COMET options? So run through the COMET algorithm, okay? But some people might use a drug called Lonsurf, so fatigue, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, infection, blood clot side effects here. This is a tougher drug. It's not incredibly effective. I'm not a huge fan of it, but many people use it because we don't have anything else, right? So trials are very important here. Just ask your physician about these COMET algorithm here. That's all you need to do, okay? So again, we do the response assessment. And then the 4th line option, a lot of people use a drug called regorafenib. They might use this here and Lonsurf here. That's fine, okay? Regorafenib is a drug that has some side effects, so high blood pressure, rash. You can come back to this slide. I left it here for you. But some side effects, it's tough to handle. This is a tough drug with relatively minimal benefit. So again, I want you thinking clinical trials. I want you thinking outside the box. I want you pushing your physician, okay? So the last question to answer is, when you look at your molecular profile, is there anything unique about it, like extraordinarily unique? Is there some mutation in that profile that we can take advantage of? So here's an example of a patient who had a mutation in a gene called NTRK. So there was an abnormality here. So they used a drug called larotrectinib that can target this gene. And you can see here, there's a tremendous response. Here's the cancer, and it gets a lot better after only just 5 weeks. So this patient had this NTRK abnormality, so we could use this drug. So that's essentially it. I just took you through all of treatment. I'm going to talk about clinical trials in a minute, because that's where I think people really want to hear. But just took you through conventional options. I want you, how I want you thinking. Okay, don't worry about the details. This is just how I want you thinking. Okay, and so this is kind of a summary of it, but you already saw the details. So here's all the treatment options. Again, I can put this on Revolution Cancer. I can give you the slides so you can have it. So let's talk about clinical trials that are ongoing. So there's a lot of clinical trials in this space. Okay, a lot of people are exploring immune therapy to see if it's beneficial or not. So there was a recent clinical trial looking at a chemotherapy backbone with bevacizumab Avastin, and they basically looked at it with Tecentriq, which is immune therapy, and they found there was a benefit. So here's the deal. If you can get on a clinical trial that would give you what you would normally get, plus minus another drug that they're testing, I want you on those trials. I like trials where you're getting the standard of care arm, which you would normally get, and then you have a chance of getting something additional. The immune therapy sorts of drugs in this particular setting, looking at trying to stimulate your immune system, there are a lot of trials looking at that, okay? Those trials are interesting. I think if those trials involve a drug you would otherwise get, then those are really good. If they don't, it's a little more challenging. I don't know how effective those will be. But when all is said and done, these chemotherapy plus immune therapy trials are good ones to be on. There's a Keytruda trial ongoing right now you can look for. There are some other trials looking at immune therapy, so durvalumab plus regorafenib. If you're going to get regorafenib anyways, this is a good trial to be on. Might as well try the immune therapy too, right? If you're going to get cetuximab and regorafenib anyways, because you have this mutation, might as well be on the trial that gives you nivolumab also. It's immune therapy, right? So these trials, there's lots of trials ongoing looking at immune therapy in colon cancer. They are reasonable trials. Are they something that we fully expect will work? No, I think it's challenging. Okay? We've been burned by this a little bit. Do I think they're worth doing, particularly if you're going to get it with standard of care? Absolutely. So there's a list of trials for you here. You can look at them. There are trials targeting this protein called ATR. So if you have a mutation in ATR on your molecular profile, I want you to look at these drugs, these trials. Okay, so just get your molecular profile from a physician, see if there's an ATR mutation. It's rare, but if you have it, I want you thinking about these particular drugs. There are some combination trials looking at Lonsurf, right? So if you're going to get Lonsurf anyways, you might as well be on a trial that has a combination. Those are reasonable. There are some trials looking at PARP inhibitors. So what are PARP inhibitors? So PARP inhibitors are a class of drug we're using to target cancers that have issues with DNA repair. Okay, now I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but there are some PARP inhibitors in trial. The data here has been equivocal. I'm a little nervous about these, but if you have a mutation in a gene called BRCA1, BRCA2, ATM, CHEK2, RAD50, any of these mutations we see with what's called homologous recombination deficiency. So if you have homologous recombination deficiency, just ask your physician. If you have homologous recombination deficiency, I think these trials are definitely worth looking at, okay? So ask your physician if you have homologous recombination deficiency, the HRD, the molecular profile I talked about. And if you do, then ask about these trials. I think it's interesting. There are some regorafenib combinations we talked about. So again, if you get regorafenib anyways, go ahead and be on a trial. I like these aggressive surgery local regional approaches. If you can get on a trial where they're looking at something like PIPAC for peritoneal carcinomatosis, where they're really trying to be aggressive surgically or aggressive local regionally, I love those trials. I don't know what's going to happen with them. I'm not God, but I love, love, love those trials. Okay. If you can get on those trials where they're being very aggressive with debulking surgery, aggressive with trying to treat local regionally, I love those trials for patients. Okay. Other trials that I like trials where we're looking at mechanisms of attack that we've never looked at before in colon cancer. I like the unknown here a lot. I don't like kind of doing the same thing over and over. I don't like things that I think are not going to work based on my experience in other tumors. So I like some of these. So there are some 4-1BB agonists, okay? So EU101, R0712290. Interesting trials, would be worth looking at those to see if maybe that will help. There's an ERK1/2 inhibitor, okay? So I think this is interesting. It's been in trial for a little while, but that would also be interesting. There's this CDOT platform for patients with the folate receptor alpha. So they make folate receptor alpha also interesting. There's some vaccine trials that are interesting. There's this trial I think is really interesting, okay? This is an anti-CEA antibody. So it basically sees the CEA that the colon cancer, expresses, and it's an antibody to CEA that has a radio label on it. So it's like radioactive anti-CEA antibody. I like this as an option. I think you should look at that if you can. There are chemotherapy-based trials, FOLFIRINOX, PIPAC, I think is interesting. These are fine. I don't know that they're going to really move the needle that much, although this PIPAC is interesting. I think that's good. But when all is said and done, I really like new mechanisms of attack. Okay, so if you have a PDGFR-A mutation, I like the idea of using avapritinib. Okay. I like the idea of autologous killer cell therapy. I just like doing something new that hasn't been done before, because I don't like practicing insanity. Like, I don't like doing the same thing over and over and expecting the same result. So I like these trials. Okay. If you are MSI high, there are certain trials that are ongoing or interesting. We talked about this about an hour and a half ago, but there are some, like, different trials looking at it, LAG3 antibody, toll-like receptor 2/1 agonist. I don't want to go through this too much. These are all very interesting trials. I would look for these if you have MSI high. Okay. But the bottom line is, I want you thinking comet, comet, comet every time you see a physician. Go back to this slide deck. Okay. I will put it online for you, or you can watch it. Just pause the actual talk and just say, okay, I'm getting this drug. Let me see what Dr. relates to the prominent side effects are. Super easy, right? Not complicated. Don't make it too hard. It looks complicated. It's really not. It's pretty simple. Okay. So don't be shy, be loud, challenge your physician, not in a bad way, right? But just say, hey, is this an option? Is this an option? Is this an option? I saw this trial. This was discussed. So one thing that happens with cancer doctors, a little bit problematic, is people get a little myopic, right? So if you're at Sloan Kettering or you're at MD Anderson, you only see the trials that you're doing. You don't really see what's happening outside of your institution. And sometimes those individuals think, oh, I have the best trials. Well, that might not necessarily be true, right? You may not have taken this other trial, taken this trial. You may not be aware of this. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world. Probably can't possibly be aware of everything happening in the world. So, don't be myopic. Look at everything. Go to clinicaltrials.gov. Look at all the trials that are ongoing, and go to these institutions that have good trials. Of course, that's important, but just don't be myopic and challenge your physician. Please ask to see your scans. Please ask to see the clinical trials that are at the institution and elsewhere. And please ask about your molecular profile. Understand that your journey is different than everyone else's. The thought process is the same. That thought process I gave you today is the same. And the reason why that matters, I didn't really go through this, but I want to talk about this very briefly now. The reason it matters, why I think it's important to think 5 moves ahead, think about what the next treatment would be, is number one, because if you don't do that, you might render yourself ineligible for a clinical trial you want to use later. Let me explain that. There might be a drug being tested in the second or the third line, second option, third option, okay, that you are thinking might be attractive, and you want to be on that trial if you need it. You want to have that in your back pocket. Well, if you get a certain first treatment, that might make you ineligible for that drug. So you might want to use the first treatment that allows you to still have that other option in second or third line. That's part of the reason it's important. The other reason it's important is because if you don't have a good backup plan, right now you've got to say your 4th move, you're on the 4th step, okay? And you look at your 5th step and your 6th step and your 7th step, and you're like, this is unappealing. These don't look like they're going to be effective. Well, you have to do something better, right? So that helps you see the future and it helps you prepare for it. You don't want to get to a point where the scan looks worse and now you've got no idea what to do. I'm always trying to plan for that 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead, 8, 9 months ahead, right? If I know my next 5 options are not that great, I'm immediately thinking about clinical trials, trying to do better, right? So that's why it matters too. It's really, really important. I think people blow this off thinking it's not important. No, it's absolutely important. It's important for so many reasons, those of which I just discussed. The inches clearly matter. So, obviously go to the first talk I talked about, but make sure you're hypervigilant about your symptoms and just reporting them, particularly getting immune therapy or, you're on chemo, you have a lot of diarrhea, please report that. That's important. We got to, address that. Some people have what's called a DPD deficiency in it. So an enzyme we call DPD, where you can have a profound amount of diarrhea on 5-fold uracil. So about 1% of the population has that. That can be a problem. There's also people with the UGAT1 mutation who it's pretty rare, but if you have that mutation, irinotecan is much more toxic than it should be. So please let us know. Okay. And then just come back here for reference. Again, I don't expect anyone to get all of this today. I didn't expect you to sit through it. I'm really impressed that you did. The bottom line is I gave you all the tools. It's going to just walk through it. You can go back to it again. It's all here, right? And there's no surprise. There's nothing extraordinary about us, but please be aggressive in your thought process and please push your doctor. Thank you guys. I'll see you next week with a different tumor type, but I'll answer any questions people have. Feel free to ask anything you want. And we will post this on YouTube.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions here for you.
Of course.
From what I hear you saying, you can't assume that your doctor is going to know or going to propose all of the trials that are available out there, that we have to do our own homework and go research it ourselves.
Yeah, I think
can't assume that my doctor is going to recommend the best trial for me. I have to do the research on my own too.
Yeah, I think every doctor has the best intentions, right, Ollie? But, we all live in our own bubbles at times. Yeah. And
Right.
so I think you need to be an advocate. I think, every patient needs to advocate. The whole idea behind the series is, Ollie, is we're trying to allow patients to advocate for themselves in profound ways, in ways that people haven't done in history. Like we're trying to make it so that patients can be advocates at a historical level. And so I think, yeah, it's important, doctors can get myopic, me included, absolutely me included, or I'm just looking at the trials I have, but you got to push them and you got to say, hey, maybe you don't have the right trial for me. That's right, Ollie.
And then are there any situations where we may want to get scans more frequently than every 2 to 3 months?
Yeah, good question, Ollie. In general, 2 to 3 months is pretty much what you want to do. Sometimes if the CEA like explodes on you, right? I do it every 2 to 3 weeks whenever I see a patient. Let's say the CEA goes from 50 to 1,000, right? Something crazy, suggesting something is acutely changed. Then you'll do a scan immediately. Yeah. But in general, Ollie, you have to be a little careful. If you do the scan too frequently, right? Let's say you started a new treatment and you do the scan too soon, let's say in 4 weeks. Well, you don't know if it's working or not. That's too soon, right? And so if you wait too long though, right? Let's say you did 6 months. Well, now you have a problem. Now it might be that you missed when it wasn't working. And now the patient's had 4 or 5 months of disease getting worse and you missed it, So I tend to do every 2 to 3 months. I think most of my colleagues do too, Ollie, but yeah.
And one more final one. How effective do you think these Cologuard screening tests are?
Yeah, it's 92% sensitivity, right? So it picks up 92% of patients. It makes me really nervous. That 8% makes me really nervous. And so I'm definitely one who advocates for colonoscopies. I don't really like people doing Cologuards. I know people are freaked out of colonoscopies. I've actually had 3 in my life just because, various issues. And so I'm 46 and I had 3 already. I mean, they're not fun, obviously, but I definitely think you do need colonoscopies. Cologuards are okay. They're better than nothing, no doubt, but it's still an issue. As you know, Ollie, I think we talked about this. All these companies, Grail, Freenome, Garden Health, they actually have tests for colorectal cancer now, cell-free DNA blood tests, which I think will be better than Cologuard in the future. And so we'll be doing those.
Okay. Thank you, Bassam. Appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Amazing, as always. Anyone
Hi,
else?
Bassam.
Yeah,
Can I ask you a couple?
Yeah, of course, man.
Hiya, thank you. This is a couple on my particular sort of cancer, if you don't mind. But I know you don't know the backstory and things, so just a general. Obviously, I've got a BRAF V600E mutation. I'm on cetuximab and encorafenib at the moment. Seems to be working all right. My next step is a couple of clinical trials that could be available in the UK. One's a porcupine inhibitor.
Yeah.
And the other one is, it might be a bit wild, this one, but an oncolytic virus. They both got nivolumab as a side, as a combination treatment.
Yeah.
Which one would you sort of gravitate towards, if you like, if it were you?
So I like both just because they're novel, right? I like that they're relatively unique. So I like that you both of those in terms of just the novelty. It depends on tumor burden a little bit, Andrew, just knowing a little bit of your backstory. I know a little bit about it. I think at the moment, it would also depend a little bit on, can I do them in sequence, right? If I do the oncolytic virus, does that make me ineligible for the porcupine inhibitor behind it? Or if I do the reverse, can I get both, right? So it would depend a little bit on that. I think I would try, if you have a minimal amount of tumor burden, I would try the oncolytic virus, go for broke. I think the oncolytic virus is really high ceiling, right? So high risk, high ceiling. Right?
At the moment, I've got a bit of a tumor. I had surgery in June to remove an abdominal wall for metastases.
Yeah.
But while the surgeon was in there, she found some on my peritoneum. Huh? So it's not a match. You give it a score of a 7 out of, is it 7 out of 31 that they score it at?
Yep. So I think in your case, Andrew, number one, I think I told you this before. I love the approach your surgeons take. They're very aggressive with you. Some surgeons wouldn't do what you had done. So yeah. I love the approach that you've taken. You're a young guy. I absolutely think they should be aggressive. I like the idea of the oncolytic virus just because it's, so this is direct injection oncolytic virus to the tumor?
Yeah, I think it is, yeah.
Direct injection. Well, okay. So that's a little different. So it's not systemic. So
the nivolumab is systemic.
Yeah. But so if you're only getting if you only have the one lesion, right, and you're getting nivolumab in addition to that, I like the idea of that. Like if you got that 7 standard mass, it's localized, you don't have a whole lot of these elsewhere. I like the idea of directly injecting it with the oncolytic virus, like T-VEC in melanoma. We use T-VEC in melanoma, right? Very similar mechanism. And I like that idea. And then saving the porcupine inhibitor behind it.
Right. Yeah. Right. Brilliant. My CEA doesn't work at all for a tumor marker. I'm investigating a few others. This at the moment, my CA72-4 is elevated.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's good. For me, tumor markers are all relative. It's a relative sort of phenomenon. So you're right. You get to a point where a lot of the colon cancers don't make CEA, right? As long as you have a marker that you can trust, right?
Yeah.
And you're just looking at relative differences. I don't care about the absolute number per se, right? I just want to know, did it increase? Did it decrease? Right.
Yeah.
And so if you have a marker that decreases as your scans get better that you can rely on, then I would just go to town with that. I would stick with that. So I think in your case, it makes sense.
Yeah, right, brilliant. And just next generation sequencing, I had a Guardant 360 done, and it brought up a GNAS R201H mutation, but that was the only one. It didn't even register the BRAF mutation, so which is quite odd. So what would you? I'm not too sure about Guardant really. Is there a better?
Such a good point, my friend. So in general, when you do a liquid biopsy, where you're looking at the cell-free DNA in the blood, that oftentimes will correlate with what you see in the tumor, but sometimes it's not true, like in your case, right? So it's missing it. So think of it like this, okay? When you have cancer, a cancer starts here, right? And then it spreads to different locations. The genetic profile of this lesion versus this lesion can be different, right? It can look different. So when you're doing a blood test, in theory, you're getting kind of parts of every one of these tumors, okay? So these tumors are shedding cells into the blood and you're getting that collective DNA, okay?
Yeah.
But imagine that here is the BRAF V600E mutation and here there is none, right? Let's say that this isn't really shedding particularly much, okay? So it's not really causing a lot of cell-free DNA. You're not going to capture it. What I like for you, though, what I think is really important, this is critical. If you're a situation like yours, Andrew, where it's growing in one spot, right? It's not growing everywhere. It's this one spot that's a problem. I would biopsy that spot and I would send that for genetic profiling. So I wouldn't rely on liquid biopsy for you as much as I would direct tissue, right? And I don't care what you do, Foundation One, Tempus, Caris, Neogenomics, doesn't matter what company you send that to, Sema4, I don't care. But you're going to want a biopsy of that tissue for sure, because that's growing independent of everything else, suggesting it's different, right? Something might be going on there. So I absolutely would biopsy that and send it to Foundation One. Something I do, Foundation One's fine. Tempus also I do a lot with. They're excellent. I would send it. I would do that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks very much.
My pleasure, Andrew. Any other questions? Yeah, and Andrew, it's great to see you, man. You know how much I care about you. Just let me know if I can help.
Good to see you as well.
Any other questions, guys?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Sorry, I've been off camera all the time. I have small children.
Great. No, you're
I have
great.
small children in the background who you really don't want to watch making a scene in the background. I'm
I
sure.
got 2 kids too. I would have no problem with them making a scene.
Oh, marvelous. They'll come in and make a scene, no doubt. Now I'm talking. 2 questions. Background similar to Andy. I am BRAF on Beacon doublet. My difference is I was originally on a curative pathway, but I only have nodal disease now. It's very widespread. Nobody, including you today, really talks about nodes. Okay. People say things like immuno should work better because it's in nodes. People say things like systemic might work less well. My problem at the moment, we don't really know if Beacon is working because nodes go up and down. So we're on constant alert for looking for what to do next. So I guess 2 questions. 1, how do you approach nodes? Yep. And nodal only, small volume, but everywhere. And 2, then how do you think about that next step into trials? From there, when it's a constant rotation of we're always on the, it's going to fall over tomorrow, or maybe it's not. It's going to fall over tomorrow, maybe it's not. Yeah, no, I think number 1, you allude to the notion that, you live scan to scan. It's always a little nerve-wracking for a physician. It's nerve-wracking, let alone for a patient. Just living in scan to scan, it sucks. No, I get it. And so nodal disease to me, I don't really separate it out per se. And that's why you didn't hear me talk a lot about it. The problem with nodal disease is really not something you can surgically remove, right? That's the issue, unless it's like a certain location, but diffuse nodes are tough. The second thing with nodal disease is sometimes very hard to interpret. If you have a 1.5 centimeter node in your abdomen, right? Sometimes that's not cancer. In some situations that's normal, 1 to 1.5 centimeters. So what I sometimes do with nodal disease, and I think for you, Claire, it makes sense. If you can, have you had a PET scan by chance or not? PET scan, a new one's coming next week.
Yeah. So you're following with PET scans or you're following with CTs?
It was a CT for the last one, PETs every other kind of thing.
I like, and your disease is hypermetabolic on PET scans or not? Like it takes up the tracer?
It has done so far.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I like PET scans and nodal disease because I think I can tell more, right? As long as you're one of those that takes up the tracer, I like that a lot. In terms of trials though, you know, honest to God, Claire, I would just do the same sort of process that Andrew's doing, except you wouldn't be in a candidate for oncolytic. You need something more diffuse, like that's going to get more systemic, right? But I think that I wouldn't think about it any differently in terms of trials that I would pursue, except I would not use local treatments, like an oncolytic virus that you inject directly into a particular tumor. I would use more systemic therapies. But to be honest, Claire, we don't really differentiate nodal disease versus not in terms of immune therapy. I think you'd still be a great candidate. Well, you'd still be a candidate for the immune therapy trials. I'm a little worried about immune therapy in patients who are not MSI high, right? And who are not TMB high in colon cancer. I'm actually very worried about it. There was a recent study looking at immunotherapy, ipilimumab plus nivolumab in MSS stable patients. That looked okay, right? There was a trial looking at nivolumab plus the BRAF inhibitor, encorafenib plus cetuximab. You wouldn't be a candidate now because you're already on your treatment, but that's also reasonable. I think for you, right, the immunotherapy trials make sense, but if they're being given in the context of additional treatments, right? I wouldn't want immunotherapy alone in you. That would not be, for me, the ideal trial. In general, not just you, in general. I don't like putting all my eggs in the immunotherapy basket in MS stable patients.
The problem is there aren't many additional treatments to put them alongside if you've already blasted through FOLFOXIRI and Beacon. Yeah,
so they have regorafenib plus, I'm not a huge fan of regorafenib, but they do have regorafenib plus Opdivo, they have durvalumab plus Opdivo and plus regorafenib. So they do have these regorafenib backbones, they have the Lonsurf backbones, right? So I would look at some of those with immune therapy, those backbones, okay? I don't have a problem if you want to do Ipi plus Nivo, that's fine, that would be fine. As far as the trial is concerned, the initial data looked okay. The data that came out was actually quite promising. And so those are fine. But to your point, Claire, I think where you're going with this, I don't like Lonsurf alone. I don't like regorafenib alone, right? If you're going to do those in combination with something else. What does your molecular profile show, Claire? Anything different? Anything else?
I have it done off the original tumor and it shows nothing immediately targetable. Nothing very interesting was where everyone came back. We're getting a liquid done now to check on TMB and things, but no one's very hopeful.
No, I appreciate that, but maybe you have like a homologous recombination deficiency, right? Maybe you have an ARID1A, or maybe you have something like a P10 loss or something. So not P10. So like check RAD50, RAD51, check to any of those. Like maybe there's something now that you can use a PARP inhibitor for. Maybe there's P10 loss you can use an mTOR inhibitor for. I think it's definitely worth doing, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely worth doing that. But to your overlying question, Claire, there's no special thing that we do with lymph node disease. We don't think about it, separately, to be honest. I like the idea of PET scans for you. I like following it that way. And then just keep me posted. I'm on LinkedIn. Just let me know what you're at.
Super. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. Any other questions, guys? Concerns, comments?
Thank you, Bob.
Quick one, sorry. I think I've missed something that's quite pivotal on my when I spoke about the porcupine trial. I've actually been tested and I've got an RSPO2, RSPO3 mutation.
Oh yeah. Okay.
From
that
was in the original sigmoid tumor that got taken out.
Yeah, I like that. So for you, Andrew, I think you have two very viable options. If you just have that one lesion that's causing a problem, I like the idea of an oncolytic virus to that lesion with nivolumab behind it. And I like I like the porcupine trial behind it, right? I like you having these options. So I think in your case, I like both options. I would sequence them that way.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. All right, guys, great to see you. I'm around. Please let me know if you need anything. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.